Hey everybody, today I'm going to share with you a article I've been working on last week about creating a hiring rubric for technical writers. So I'll give you a little bit of background on this one. A couple years ago when I was managing an engineering team at a startup in Chicago, I made what felt like a string of bad hires. I realized in retrospect, it's just like I struggled with one hiring process, brought somebody on that wasn't a great fit a couple times over the course of a couple of years. And it made me kind of call into question what I was doing. I went through a number of iterations of my hiring process. I talked to my boss and a lot of mentors about this. And one thing that I realized was that I didn't really know what I was looking for. I read a great book along that process there called Recruit Rock Stars. I hate the term rock stars, okay? So forgive me that it's got that in the title, but the book's great. Jeff Hyman wrote it. He's a professor out at Northwestern and a good recruiter and business guy. So I really enjoyed one thing especially about the book, and that was that he shows a process that you can use to evaluate candidates objectively and consistently. Those two things are surprisingly hard to do. So everybody has in their mind the ideal candidate or the ideal coworker that they want to work with, but it's so hard to quantify and objectively evaluate people when they come into the office to do an interview. So one thing I found really helpful back when I was trying to figure out how to hire better was to build a rubric around hiring. So it's kind of a funny intersection of things, but the last startup I worked for was an ed tech startup, and we did grading of K through 12 papers. And something very common in grading that you see with almost every paper you grade is a rubric. And a rubric can be as simple as a checklist of things the person has to do, or it can be as complex as like a matrix of attributes the person should display with different levels that they might display them at. And then it will show kind of specific examples of how a person might meet this level for a specific attribute. So I created a hiring rubric for engineers back at the Grade Network, the last startup I worked at. And that was super helpful. And I brought on a great engineer with it, and I kind of solidified it into a process. I continued to iterate on it and made the rubric better. I used it as an evaluation tool for my engineers that were actually like in their monthly evaluations to kind of show them how they're doing and watch them progress up the rubric. And I took that same process and sort of adapted it to what I'm doing at Draft. So at Draft, I work with technical writers. And these are people who are mostly software engineers who want to write on the side, or people who are kind of just, maybe they're former writers that are exploring a transition into tech. And so they're learning programming. So they're somewhere in that spectrum. And what I did was sort of took the key attributes that it takes to be a technical writer at Draft. I wrote them down into a rubric, which you can get in the link that's attached here. And what I came up with were 3 big categories with 10 total attributes that I pay attention to for writers at Draft. So first big category is writing. You obviously have to have writing skills if you're going to be a technical writer. We write for blogs, and so I care that the person understands basic grammar conventions. I care that they understand how to construct things in the English language. But to be honest, we do a lot of heavy editing for some technical content. So sometimes someone can have a lot of like a really high level technical ability and a really lower level writing ability, and we might be able to compensate for that. Now, ideal candidates have all of our categories and all of the major attributes covered, but let's get realistic. It can be really hard to fill out your pool of writers with perfect candidates. So a lot of times we're looking at trade-offs. When we bring someone on who's not quite as strong at writing, would there be a good fit for them somewhere anyway? The next thing we look at is technical ability. And this can, obviously they've got to be able to do some kind of software development or understand it enough to speak to it. We write content for software developers. So technical depth ends up being a very important attribute for our writers. Really basic technical writing just kind of covers the how-to docs that you might find online for free. But technical depth means the writer can actually go in and explain why something works the way it works, or how it works, or finds the underlying code in the open source library that it uses to make this decision. And that is super hard to find in writers, but also very, very important, and something that makes them much more valuable when working with clients. The other thing that people miss on technical ability is demand for the kind of technical ability they have. So let's just say it straight up. Knowing some skill that's not in very high demand right now might not be as valuable as knowing a skill that's in really high demand by my clients right now. So at Draft, we're working with clients mostly working in open source technologies like JavaScript and Python and Ruby and PHP, but we occasionally get somebody who's working in something like .NET. And when that happens, I got to go find a writer who's good with that technology. And that means I'm going to give preference to people who are good in that technology, even if I might have to edit them a little heavier to get them up to speed with the writing category. And then the last category of things I look for in writers at Draft is their work habits. And you can't ignore this when you're bringing someone on. Even in my case, I'm bringing on part-time freelancers. They're very flexible schedules, very flexible ability, but that's honestly even more important for their work habits because they've got to be really good communicators on and offline. They have to be able to write stuff that is well done for the client, but also to be able to communicate the expectations that they understand, or to be able to communicate delays, or communicate that they don't understand something. If they're not proactive and really ready to communicate with me over email, which is how I do it today, then they're not going to be a good fit. They're not going to last with Draft. Next attribute I look at is their attitude. So how do they take revisions? Because let's be honest, everybody gets revised. That's what editing is all about. A second pair of eyes on your writing will mean that you've got to improve it. So we look at attitude. How do they take that feedback? And then finally, how independent are those writers? Can they actually go off and do this on their own, pace their work out? Because really at the end of the day, they're freelance contractors. I'm not going to tell them when they need to log in and write something. They have a final due date that something needs to get back to a client. But beyond that, they've got to figure out how to pace things. And that independence, that ability to work without being told is really, really important for us. Now, you're not going to need the exact same things that I need when you make a hire. Even if it's a technical writing hire, you're going to have slight variations on this rubric. So this rubric is a starting point. It's a great place to, if you are thinking about hiring someone like a technical writer or someone with some combination of technical and marketing and maybe written skills, this would be a great rubric to start with, but it's not the end. You're going to have to evaluate this versus your organization and the kind of role you need to fill. So I hope this helps you get started. Thanks a lot for watching.